the day my entire family raised their hands to vote me out of the inheritance. They popped champagne to celebrate. They thought they were teaching the failure working at a shelter a tough lesson. They did not know the only person authorized to sign off on every single trust document was actually me. Once they realized the truth, that vote to kick me out became the evidence I needed to revoke their access instead. My name is Brianna Pugh, and as I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, I realized that blood might be thicker than water, but money was the only thing that actually mattered in this room. We were on the 42nd floor of the Pugh Meridian Holdings building in downtown Chicago. The view through the floor-to-ceiling glass walls was spectacular, offering a panoramic look at Lake Michigan and the sprawling city below. But no one was looking outside. All eyes were fixed on the head of the table. The air in the conference room was recycled and frigid, kept at a constant 68 degrees to ensure alertness. 20 of my relatives were scattered around the oval table, a sea of Italian wool suits, limited edition silk scarves, and wristwatches that cost more than the average American mortgage. They were the Pugh dynasty, or at least, that is what they like to call themselves on their Instagram bios. I was 34 years old, a graduate of an Ivy League university that my grandmother had paid for, and currently, the black sheep of this very expensive flock. My father, Harold Pugh, stood up. He buttoned his jacket with a sharp, decisive movement. He did not look like a father. He looked like a man about to acquire a distressed asset. "We have a problem in this family," Harold announced, his voice booming off the glass walls. He paced behind his chair, letting the silence stretch out. "It is a problem of failure. It is a problem of mediocrity dragging down the exceptionalism that my mother, God rest her soul, built this empire upon." He did not say my name. He did not have to. The collective gaze of the room shifted toward me like a tide. My cousin Logan, sitting 3 seats down, smirked and adjusted his cufflinks. Logan ran a boutique hedge fund that had lost $4 million in the last fiscal quarter. But because he drove a Porsche and wore suits cut on Savile Row, the family considered him a titan of industry. Across from him sat Madeline, who called herself a lifestyle curator. Her content creation studio had been bleeding cash for 3 years straight, kept alive only by silent injections of capital from the family trust. Yet, she was praised for her visibility and her brand. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, wearing a gray suit I had bought off the rack at a department store sale. It was clean, professional, and entirely invisible in a room full of peacocks. I worked full-time at the Harbor Street Support Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping homeless veterans and single mothers get back on their feet. It was gritty, exhausting, and necessary work. To my family, it was an embarrassment. Harold pressed a button on a remote, and a large screen descended from the ceiling. A chart appeared, titled Family Legacy Contribution Assessment. It was a bar graph. The bars for Logan, Madeline, and even my 19-year-old cousin who had just started a DJ career were towering green columns. They represented projected value, vague concepts of brand equity, and social capital. At the very end of the chart was a single red bar that dipped below the baseline. Underneath it was my name. "Brianna," Harold said, finally looking at me. His eyes were cold, devoid of any paternal warmth. "You have been out of university for 12 years. In that time, you have not started a company. You have not expanded our portfolio. You have not married into influence. You work at a shelter." "It is a support center," I corrected him, keeping my voice level. "It is a drain," Harold snapped. He gestured to the screen. "Look at this. We ran the numbers. Your annual salary is $35,000. $35,000. That is what Logan spends on client dinners in a month. You live in a 400-square-foot apartment in a neighborhood that requires a security escort to visit. You drive a 10-year-old sedan. You are 34 years old. Brianna, and you are statistically insignificant." A ripple of laughter went through the room. It wasn't loud, just a polite, mocking titter. Madeline leaned forward, offering a sympathetic smile that did not reach her eyes. "We are just worried about you. Bree, it is tragic, Really, you had so much potential. Now look at you. You are not really living up to the Pew name, are you? It is almost like you are allergic to success." Harold nodded, accepting her comment as a valid piece of evidence. He tapped the screen where the red bar representing my life descended into the negative. "I have labeled this category negative value," Harold declared, "and I am proposing a new amendment to the family bylaws. The Pew Trust was established to foster excellence. It was designed to fuel leaders, innovators, and creators. It was not designed to subsidize failure." He paused for dramatic effect, placing both hands on the table and leaning toward me. "The proposal is simple. Any beneficiary who does not maintain a career of high standing, defined by an income threshold of $200,000 a year or an equity position in a recognized firm, will be stripped of their trust fund access. We are calling it the Merit Clause." The room buzzed with excitement. This was a sport to them. They were culling the herd, and they felt powerful doing it. They did not see the irony that most of them were subsidized by the very trust they were voting to protect. They only saw me. The reminder that you could have the name and not the money. The one who made them feel uncomfortable because I actually worked for a living. "We cannot keep throwing good money after bad," Logan said, raising his hand before the vote was even called. "I vote yes. We need to cut the dead weight." Harold smiled. It was a predator's smile. "Let us make it official," Harold said. "All those in favor of the Merit Clause, and specifically, the immediate revocation of Brianna Pugh's access to the family trust until she proves she is no longer a failure. Raise your hand." One by one, the hands went up. Logan, Madeline, Uncle Martin, Aunt Sarah, even the younger cousins, looking around to make sure they were following the pack, raised their hands. 19 hands reached for the ceiling. I looked around the room. I memorized every face. I looked at the heavy gold rings on Uncle Martin's fingers. I looked at the diamond tennis bracelet on Aunt Sarah's wrist. I looked at the way my father stood tall, puffing his chest out, believing he had just saved the family fortune from his disappointment of a daughter. I did not cry. I did not beg. I reached into my bag and pulled out a simple black notebook and a pen. I opened it to a fresh page. Harold watched me, expecting an outburst. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to plead for my allowance like a child. Instead, I wrote down the date, October 12th. Then I wrote down the time, 10:14 in the morning. I looked at Aunt Sarah. She was the only one who wavered. For a split second, her hand trembled, and she looked at my notebook with a flicker of confusion. She knew my grandmother well. She knew that my grandmother and I had been close in those final years, but the pressure of the room was too great. She kept her hand up, looking away from me. "So it is unanimous," Harold boomed. "Effective immediately. Brianna is cut off. I will instruct the bank to lock her accounts by noon today." He looked at me, triumphant. "Do you have anything to say, Brianna? Perhaps an apology for wasting our resources for so long?" I finished writing the last name on my list. I capped my pen with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silent room. I looked up at my father, then scanned the faces of my 19 relatives. My heartbeat was steady. My hands were dry. "I only have one question," I said. My voice was soft, but it carried clearly to the back of the room. Harold rolled his eyes. "Make it quick. We have reservations for lunch." I looked him dead in the eye. "You want to include this specific vote, with these specific names, in the official meeting minutes and the permanent family archive? You want this to be a matter of formal record?" Harold laughed. The whole room laughed with him. It was a sound of pure condescension. "Of course we do," Harold said, chuckling as he began to gather his papers. "We want it carved in stone. Brianna, we want future generations to know that this was the day we trimmed the fat. Put it in the record, frame it." He did not understand. None of them understood. They thought I was asking out of shame. They thought I was asking because I was afraid of the finality of it. "Very well," I said, standing up. I picked up my notebook and placed it into my bag. I smoothed the front of my cheap gray suit. "I just wanted to be sure," I added, mostly to myself. They were already moving on. Logan was popping a bottle of champagne that had been chilling in a bucket on the sidebar. Corks flew, glasses clinked. They toasted to excellence. They toasted to the Pew legacy. They toasted to getting rid of me. I walked toward the heavy glass doors. No one stopped me. No one said goodbye. They were too busy celebrating their victory over the girl who worked at a shelter. They had no idea that they had just handed me the exact weapon I needed. They thought they were the board of directors. They did not know they were just employees who had just violated the company policy of the real boss. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the hallway, leaving the laughter and the smell of expensive champagne behind me. The silence of the corridor was welcoming. I walked to the elevator and pressed the down button. The door slid open, and I stepped inside. As the elevator began its descent from the 42nd floor, I checked my watch. It was 10:20 in the morning, by noon. They expected my access to be cut. They were in for a very long afternoon. Stepping out of the Pew Meridian Holdings building felt like depressurizing a deep-sea submarine. 1 minute I was surrounded by the scent of Italian leather and the hum of climate-controlled silence, and the next, the raw wind of Chicago was slapping me in the face. It was the kind of wind that found every gap in your coat, a physical reminder that the city did not care who your father was or what your last name happened to be. I pulled my collar up and walked toward the train station. My cousins were likely calling Ubers or waiting for their private drivers to circle the block, but I had a schedule to keep, and the Red Line was the only way to stay on budget. The train ride was a 40-minute decompression chamber. I sat squeezed between a woman with 3 grocery bags and a teenager listening to music so loud I could hear the snare drums through his headphones. I closed my eyes and let the rhythm of the tracks rattle the tension out of my bones. By the time I reached my stop on the north side, the mahogany boardroom felt like a fever dream. This was my reality, not the 42nd floor, but the cracked pavement of a neighborhood where the rent was manageable and the neighbors actually knew each other's names. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up that had been built before the First World War. It smelled faintly of old wood and the curry someone was cooking in Unit 2. I unlocked my door and stepped into the space that my family had spent the morning mocking. It was small, barely 400 square feet, but it was mine. There was no maid service here. There were no designer throw pillows. There was just a futon I had bought secondhand, a sturdy oak desk I had refinished myself, and shelves stacked high with case files. I set my bag down and went to the small kitchenette to boil water for tea. While the kettle hissed, I looked at the corkboard above my desk. It was covered in index cards, each one representing a life I was trying to stabilize at the Harbor Street Support Center. There was Mr. Moss Henderson, a Vietnam veteran who needed a new pair of glasses so he could read his benefits paperwork. I had circled the cost in red marker, $150. I was trying to find a donor for that. Next to it was a note for Maria, a single mother of 2 who needed a security deposit for an apartment, $1,200. I had raised $800 so far. This was what my father called negative value. I sat at my desk and opened my personal ledger. It was a simple spiral notebook, distinct from the black one I used for family meetings. I ran the numbers for the month, after rent, utilities, and the student loan payments for the master's degree. My father refused to acknowledge. I had exactly $214 left for groceries and emergencies. I tapped the pen against the paper. I would have to skip the fresh produce market this week and stick to rice and beans. It was fine. I had done it before. My gaze drifted to the silver frame on the corner of the desk. It was the only expensive thing I owned, a gift from my grandmother, Margaret Pugh. In the photo, we were sitting on the dock at her lake house. I was 12, and she was laughing, her head thrown back, holding a fishing rod. She looked nothing like the stern matriarch whose portrait hung in the corporate lobby. She looked like a woman who knew a secret. The phone vibrating against the hard wood of the desk snapped me out of the memory. I looked at the screen. It was Northbridge Private Trust Services. The caller ID displayed the name Elena Ward. I had 3 missed calls from her already. I had kept my phone on silent during the meeting and the commute. Elena never called 3 times unless the building was on fire. I picked up the device and swiped to answer. "Brianna," Elena said, her voice tight and breathless. "Thank goodness. I have been trying to reach you for an hour. Are you sitting down? I am. Elena, I said, taking a sip of the tea. It was cheap chamomile, but it was hot. I assume you received the email from my father. Received it? Brianna. It is flagged as a code red priority. It came directly from Harold's executive office, copied to the entire board of trustees at the bank. I could hear the shuffling of papers on her end. Elena was a senior advisor, a woman who managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But right now, she sounded like a frantic schoolteacher. He has demanded a full freeze. Elena continued. He attached a document claiming the family voted unanimously to invoke the merit clause. He is claiming you are financially incompetent and a liability to the Pew legacy. He wants your access credentials revoked by the end of the business day. He was very specific about the time. Noon. I glanced at the clock on my microwave. It was 10:55. Harold was efficient when he wanted to be cruel. Okay, I said calmly. Okay? Elena repeated, her voice pitching up. Brianna, you do not seem to understand. He is trying to lock you out of the system. He is trying to cut off the water supply. Let him, I said. There was a long silence on the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in Elena's head. She had been the account manager for the Pew Family Trust for 5 years, but she had only worked with me directly for the last 2. She knew the mechanics, but she sometimes forgot the history. Elena, I said, keeping my voice low and steady, you have the operating agreement in front of you, don't you? The one my grandmother revised 3 months before she died? Yes, I have it right here, Elena said. Turn to page 42, section 7, paragraph 3. I heard the rustle of pages. I knew the text by heart. I had read it so many times in this very apartment, usually late at night when the weight of my family's disdain felt heavy enough to crush me. Elena began to read, her voice murmuring the legalese. Upon the 2nd anniversary of the passing of Margaret Pew, the administrative authority of the Pew Family Trust shall transfer in full to the designated steward. The steward shall possess sole discretion over all disbursements, investments, and beneficiary statuses. The steward is defined as... She stopped. I heard a sharp intake of breath. The steward is defined as Brianna Marie Pew. She finished, her voice barely a whisper. Correct, I said. My grandmother had played the long game. She knew her children. She knew that once she was gone, Harold and his siblings would descend on the trust like vultures. She knew they would burn through the capital on vanity projects and ego trips. So she had created a failsafe. She had set up a dummy structure for the first 2 years, a period where the bank managed things automatically, lulling the family into a false sense of security. Then, quietly, on a date that had passed 2 months ago, the power had shifted. The document they all signed at the funeral, the one they thought was just a standard acknowledgement of benefits, it was actually a transfer of power. They had been so busy asking about their monthly stipends that none of them had bothered to read the fine print. I had read every word, and I had signed my name not as a beneficiary, but as the incoming trustee. So, I continued, looking at the photo of my grandmother, my father is currently sending a demand to the bank to lock out the only person who actually works for the bank. He is asking you to block the sole trustee from accessing the funds she manages. This is a disaster for him, Elena said. If I process this request, it technically counts as a hostile action against the trust's governance. Exactly, I said. Brianna, Elena said, her tone shifting from panic to something more conspiratorial. Do you want me to call him? Do you want me to explain that he is making a mistake? I can tell him that he does not have the authority to remove you. I can stop this before it becomes official. No, I said. The word came out harder than I intended. I softened my tone. No, Elena, do not warn him. If you tell him now, he will claim it was a misunderstanding. He will say he was just testing the system. He will find a way to spin it. I need him to commit to this course of action. I need his signature on that request, and I need it filed in the permanent archive. But Brianna, if we do this, It triggers a mandatory compliance review, Elena warned. Once a formal request to remove a beneficiary is lodged, we are legally required to hold a hearing. We have to audit the claims. We have to investigate the validity of his accusations that you are a failure. I know. I said, that is the point. I want the audit. I want every single transaction he and my cousins have made in the last 8 years to be placed on the table next to mine. He says I am the failure? Let us look at the numbers. Let us look at the return on investment for Logan's hedge fund. Let us look at the burn rate on Madeline's studio. I stood up and walked to the window. The view was just a brick wall of the adjacent building and a fire escape, but I preferred it to the lake view I had seen earlier. This view was honest. Let them file the paperwork. Elena, process the request. Send him a confirmation that his ticket has been received and that a review is pending. Do not tell him I am the trustee. Just tell him that the bank takes these accusations very seriously and that a formal meeting will be scheduled to adjudicate the matter. Elena paused. I could hear her typing something on her keyboard. You are playing a dangerous game, Brianna, she said. They are going to come into that meeting expecting to see you humiliated. They are going to expect to see you stripped of everything. They are going to see exactly what they asked for. I said, they asked for a review of value. They asked to cut out the dead weight. I am just going to make sure the definition of dead weight is accurate. I can schedule the review for next Tuesday, Elena said, her voice regaining its professional composure. 10 in the morning. Make it mandatory. I said, tell them attendance is required for all beneficiaries who wish to maintain their current standing. Tell them the bank insists on it. Understood, Elena said. And Brianna? Yes? Your grandmother would have loved this. I smiled. A genuine smile this time. She is the one who wrote the script. Elena, I am just reading the lines. We hung up. I put the phone down and looked at my budget notebook again. $214. It was not a lot of money. It was barely enough to survive. But as I sat there in my cold apartment, listening to the wind rattle the window pane, I felt richer than I had ever felt in my life. My family thought they had revoked my access. They thought they had cut off my supply. They had no idea that they had just walked into a vault and locked the door from the inside, trapping themselves with the only person who had the key. I picked up my pen and turned to a fresh page in my notebook. I did not write down a grocery list. I wrote down a heading, Agenda for Tuesday. Underneath it, I began to list names, Harold, Logan, Madeline, Uncle Martin. I was not just going to attend that meeting. I was going to preside over it. And for the first time in the history of the Pugh family, the definition of success was going to be rewritten, not in ink, but in consequences. As I sat at my desk with the agenda for the upcoming meeting taking shape, my mind drifted away from the cold, cramped apartment in Chicago. I found myself pulled back to the heat and humidity of a Wisconsin summer. Specifically, the last August I spent with my grandmother before the cancer finally claimed her. It was a time that felt suspended in amber, separate from the rest of my life. The Pugh family estate on Lake Geneva was a sprawling Victorian mansion, but Grandma Margaret preferred the small, screened-in porch that overlooked the water. That was where the real business happened. It was on that porch that she taught me the language of silence. I remembered the smell of old paper and lake water. We had 2 stacks of documents on the wicker table between us. On the left was the quarterly performance report for Pugh Meridian Holdings. On the right was a stack of crumpled grocery receipts from the soup kitchen where I had been volunteering that summer. Grandma picked up the financial report. It was thick, glossy, and filled with graphs that promised endless growth. She tossed it onto the table with a dismissive thud. Then she picked up a receipt for 50 pounds of potatoes and 20 gallons of milk. She handled that receipt with reverence, smoothing out the crinkled edges. "Do you see the difference, Brianna?" she asked, her voice raspy but sharp. I looked at the numbers. One document dealt in millions of dollars, theoretical gains, and market speculation. The other dealt in cents and sustenance. "The difference is reality," she said, answering her own question. "This report on the left is noise. It is people shouting about money they have not made yet to impress people they do not like. But this receipt This is quiet. This is a meal. This is a life sustained for another day. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. Money is only loud in the hands of a fool. Brianna, those who know how to keep it are always silent. Real power does not need to announce itself. It just is. I did not fully understand her then. I was 22, fresh out of college, and still hurting from the way my father and uncles treated me. To them, I was invisible unless they needed a punching bag for their jokes. I remembered the family weekends at that very lake house. My father, Harold, and Uncle Martin would arrive in loud sports cars, the engines roaring up the gravel driveway like conquering warlords. They would spend the weekends drinking vintage scotch on the dock, their voices carrying across the water as they bragged about deals that often never materialized. Whenever I walked by, they would stop their conversation just long enough to deliver a sting. "Still saving the world, Brianna?" Harold would ask, swirling the ice in his glass. "How is the charity business? Make any profit this quarter?" Martin would laugh. A wet, choking sound. "Do not be mean. Harold, she is building character. Since she is not building a portfolio, she has to build something." They did not know that Grandma Margaret was listening. She was always there, sitting in the shadows of the porch, knitting or reading, her face impassive. But she heard every word. She saw the way they dismissed me. She saw the way they treated the staff, the way they threw money around like confetti, assuming the supply was infinite. One evening, after a particularly brutal dinner where Harold had spent 20 minutes dissecting my choice of a non-profit career as a waste of a good education, Grandma asked me to stay behind while the others went to the cigar lounge. She had called her lawyer, Mr. Sterling, to the house the next morning. I was not allowed in the room, but I saw them through the glass doors. Grandma was speaking with a fervor I had rarely seen. She was pointing at the documents, her finger tapping rhythmically against the mahogany desk. Mr. Sterling looked pale. He was trying to argue, gesturing toward the door where my father was likely nursing a hangover. But Grandma cut him off. She was rewriting the definition of the future. She told me later that afternoon, while we watched the sunset, what she had done. She did not give me the specifics then, but she gave me the philosophy. "I am adding a clause," she said, watching the sun dip below the tree line. "To manage this family is to herd cats. Brianna, greedy, fat cats. They think the money is their birthright. They think it is a tap that never runs dry. They need a steward. Not a banker, not a shark, a steward." She took my hand. Her skin was paper thin, but her grip was iron. A steward must be someone who knows the value of a dollar, not just the price of a stock. A steward must be ethical, and most importantly, a steward must be able to say no when everyone else is screaming yes. I did not realize she was talking about me until 2 years later. Sitting in the lawyer's office for the reading of the will, the room was packed. Harold, Martin, Aunt Sarah, all the cousins, everyone was there, dressed in black, but with an air of anticipation that felt more like a lottery drawing than a funeral. When Mr. Sterling read the standard bequests, the houses, the cars, the immediate cash payouts, everyone nodded. It was what they expected. But then came the section on the core trust, the massive principle that generated the family's operating income. Control of the core trust. "Mr. Sterling read, his voice shaking slightly, "shall not pass to Harold Pugh, nor to Martin Pugh. Instead, it shall be placed in a provisional status for 2 years under bank supervision. Following this period, full administrative authority and sole discretion shall transfer to the designated steward, Brianna Pugh." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room. Then, the explosion happened. Harold stood up so fast his chair tipped over. Martin started shouting about competency and mental capacity. Aunt Sarah started crying, asking how Mother could do this to them. They called me names I will never forget. They called me a usurper, a fraud, a quiet little snake. I sat there, frozen, clutching my purse. I wanted to run. I wanted to tell them I did not want it. But Mr. Sterling raised his hand. You can contest it, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. You can sue. You can drag this into probate court. But I must warn you, Mrs. Pugh included a paralysis clause. If any beneficiary contests the appointment of the steward, the entire trust is frozen. No payouts, no dividends, no allowances, nothing. For as long as the litigation lasts, and given the size of this estate, that could be 5 years. Can any of you survive 5 years without your distributions? The room went deadly quiet again. I looked at their faces. I saw the panic in their eyes. They were leveraged to the hilt. They had mortgages on their second homes, leases on their cars, debts that needed servicing next month, not in 5 years. They could not afford to fight. So they changed tactics. That was when the soft agreement was born. In the weeks following the will reading, my father and uncles cornered me. They put on their best smiles. They treated me like a fragile child who had been given a heavy burden by a senile old woman. Look, Brianna, Harold had said, putting a heavy arm around my shoulder. Mom was not thinking clearly at the end. We all know that, but we are stuck with this. So here's the plan. You are the steward on paper. Fine, we will respect that. But you do not know how to run a conglomerate. You do not know finance. So, we will make a gentleman's agreement. He leaned in, his breath smelling of coffee and mints. You just sign the paperwork we send you. You keep doing your little charity work. You stay in your lane, and we will handle the business. We will not bother you, and you do not bother us. We will treat you like family, and you just let the professionals do their job. Deal? I looked at him. I saw the arrogance. I saw the absolute certainty that I was too weak, too stupid, and too passive to ever actually exercise the power I had been given. They thought the 2-year waiting period was a formality. They thought I would just rubber stamp their lifestyle forever. I remembered Grandma's voice. Money is loud in the hands of a fool. Okay, I had whispered. They took my quietness for submission. They took my lack of arguing for agreement. For the last 2 years, since the power formally transferred to me, I had kept that facade. I signed the routine maintenance checks. I approved the standard distributions. I let them think they were in charge. But every night, in my small apartment, I did exactly what Grandma had taught me on that porch in Wisconsin. I read the reports. I analyzed the expenses. I tracked every single dollar they wasted. I saw the retreat in Aspen that was billed as a strategic planning summit, but was actually a week-long ski party costing $150,000. I saw the investment in Cousin Logan's startup that evaporated $2 million in 6 months with zero product to show for it. I saw the renovation of Aunt Sarah's pool house listed as critical infrastructure maintenance. I wrote it all down. I built a shadow archive. I let them dig their hole deeper and deeper, waiting for the moment when they would try to bury me, only to realize I was holding the shovel. Grandma had warned me about this day too. On that last afternoon, she had squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. They will tolerate you as long as they think you are harmless, she had said. But there will come a time when their greed outpaces their caution. They will try to push you out. They will reveal their true nature. And when that happens, Brianna, you must not be my granddaughter anymore. You must be the steward. You must act. I looked down at the agenda on my desk. The foreshadowing was over. The soft agreement was dead. They had broken the truce by voting to cut me off. They had mistaken my silence for emptiness, not realizing that silence is also the sound of a judge reading a verdict before the gavel comes down. The time had come. I sat at my small oak desk, the surface cleared of everything except my laptop and a single mug of cold tea. The room was dark, illuminated only by the harsh, clinical blue glow of the screen. I logged into the Northbridge Private Trust Services secure portal. The 2-factor authentication pinged my phone, and I entered the 6-digit code with a steady hand. The screen refreshed, replacing the login prompt with the central dashboard of the Pugh Family Trust. For a moment, the sheer magnitude of the numbers made my breath catch in my throat. The principal balance was still massive, a testament to the empire my grandfather had built and my grandmother had preserved. It was a number with 8 zeros, But as a steward, you do not look at the total. You look at the trend lines, and the trend lines were bleeding. I navigated to the cash flow analysis tab. The graph looked like a cliff face. In the 2 years since my grandmother passed, the withdrawal rate had accelerated by 300%. The dividends generated by our conservative investments, blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, the steady heartbeat of old money, were no longer enough to cover the burn rate. We were eating into the principal. The family was cannibalizing the very thing that kept them fed. I clicked open the pending request folder. There it was. The document my father had authorized just hours ago. It was titled, Petition for Removal of Trustee and Immediate Reallocation of Assets. I opened the file. It was 30 pages long. I began to read. The language was brutal. It was designed to strip me of not just my authority, but my dignity. My father and his lawyers had constructed a narrative where I was not just a disappointment, but a danger. The current trustee, Brianna Pugh, demonstrates a profound lack of financial acumen. Paragraph 4 read, Her lifestyle choices and professional employment in the low-income sector indicate a psychological inability to comprehend high-level asset management. She is risk-averse to the point of negligence. I scrolled down. We petition for the immediate liquidation of the conservative bond holdings to fund high-growth opportunities identified by the beneficiaries. Specifically, the transfer of $12 million to the Meridian Real Estate Growth Fund and an additional $5 million to the Pew Venture Capital arm. I froze. The Meridian Real Estate Growth Fund. That was Harold's pet project. It was a shell company buying up commercial real estate in neighborhoods that analysts said were 20 years away from gentrification. And the Pew Venture Capital arm? That was just a fancy name for Logan's gambling addiction. My hands started to tremble, not from fear, but from a cold, vibrating rage. I clenched my fists until my knuckles turned white, forcing the shaking to stop. My face, reflected in the dark glass of the screen, remained perfectly still. I looked like a statue. I opened a second window on my screen. I pulled up the transaction history for the last 24 months. I began to cross-reference their demands with their reality. They called me incompetent. They said I lacked vision. I pulled up the file for the Aspen Wellness Retreat. My Uncle Martin had pitched this as a business investment 18 months ago. He claimed it would be a luxury rehabilitation center for burned-out executives. The trust had released $600,000 for zoning permits and architectural plans. I clicked on the current status report. The project had not even broken ground. The $600,000 was gone. I traced the wire transfers, $100,000 to a private aviation company, $50,000 to a catering service in Denver, $200,000 to a consulting firm owned by Martin's college roommate. It was not a business. It was a slush fund for his ski trips. I closed that window and opened the file for Madeline's studio, the Omni Media Collective. The trust had subsidized the lease on a loft in the West Loop for $7,000 a month. The business plan projected revenue of $200,000 in the first year. I checked the actual revenue, $4,000 total for the entire year. Madeline had spent more on espresso machine maintenance than she had brought in from clients. Yet, in the document my father just sent, they claimed that my refusal to release more capital was strangling their innovation. I went deeper. I looked at Logan's hedge fund. He wanted $5 million. He claimed his algorithm had beaten the market. I pulled up the independent audit I had secretly commissioned 6 months ago. Logan's fund was down 22%. He was hiding the losses by moving money between accounts. A classic shell game that bordered on securities fraud. If I gave him $5 million, I wouldn't be investing. I would be paying off his bookies. They were not just bad at business. They were arsonists, and they were blaming me for hiding the matches. I went back to the legal document repository. I needed to find the original trust agreement, the one my grandmother had revised with Mr. Sterling. I knew the general terms, but I needed the exact wording. I scrolled past the distribution schedules and the tax evasion strategies until I found the section on governance and security. I read through the standard clauses about fiduciary duty. Then, my eyes landed on Article 9, Section C, the Liability Activation Clause. I had read it before, But in the abstract, now, I read it as a weapon. The clause stated, "In the event that any beneficiary engages in actions that threaten the structural integrity of the trust, or attempts to coerce the steward into actions that violate their fiduciary duty, the steward is granted emergency powers. These powers include the right to unilaterally freeze distributions, suspend voting rights, and restrict access to capital until such threat is neutralized." I sat back in my chair. The only sound in the room was the hum of the refrigerator. My father's petition was not just a complaint, by formally stating that they intended to liquidate stable assets to fund high-risk, unvetted personal projects, and by attempting to remove the ethically appointed guardian of those funds to do so, they had provided written proof of a threat. They had walked right into the trap. My grandmother had known. She had sat on that porch in Wisconsin, knitting her scarves, and she had simulated this exact scenario in her head. She knew that eventually, their entitlement would curdle into aggression. She knew they would try to coup the leadership, so she gave the steward a kill switch. I looked at the phrase again, attempts to coerce the steward. The vote this morning, the public humiliation, the ultimatum, it was textbook coercion. And because they had insisted on recording the vote, because my father had been so eager to put it in the permanent archive, the evidence was irrefutable. I reached for a yellow legal pad. I drew a line down the middle of the page. On the left side, I wrote, Plan A. This was the mercy path. In this scenario, I would go into the meeting on Tuesday. I would present the data. I would show them the losses. I would explain that the money was running out. I would offer them a chance to retract the petition, to accept strict budgets, and to undergo financial literacy training. If they agreed, if they showed even an ounce of humility, I would keep the liability activation clause in my back pocket. I would let them save face. I looked at the words. It seemed like a fantasy. I thought of Harold's sneer. I thought of Madeline's pitying smile. I thought of Logan popping the champagne. On the right side of the page, I wrote, Plan B. This was the justice path. In this scenario, they would double down. They would insult me. They would demand the keys to the vault. And if they did that, I would not just say no. I would trigger Article 9. I would freeze everything. Not just the extra capital, but their monthly allowances, the mortgages paid by the trust, the car leases, the tuition for their children's private schools. I would cut the power to their entire lives. I picked up my pen and started sketching out the logistics for Plan B. I would need to have the bank draft the freeze orders in advance. I would need the security team at Northbridge on standby. I would need a notarized copy of the morning's meeting minutes. As I wrote, I felt a strange sensation. The shaking in my hands had stopped completely. The coldness in my chest had been replaced by a clarity that was almost diamond hard. They wanted a thriller. They wanted a dramatic boardroom showdown where the weak little girl was crushed by the titans of industry. I closed the laptop, the screen fading to black. They were going to get their drama, but they had miscast the villain. I stood up and walked to the small window of my apartment. Outside, the streetlights of Chicago flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed. I was no longer the poor relation. I was no longer the failure. I was the bank, and the bank was about to call in the loans. The days leading up to the mandatory review meeting felt like watching a slow-motion car crash where the drivers were laughing behind the wheel. The petition to remove me had been filed. The date was set. And as far as the Pugh family was concerned, the war was already over. They had won. I was merely a clerical error that was about to be corrected. To celebrate their preemptive victory, my father insisted on a family brunch at Le Jardin, a French bistro on the Gold Coast where an omelet cost $30 and the orange juice was squeezed by hand, one orange at a time. I was invited, not out of kindness, but because they needed an audience. They needed someone to witness their ascent. I sat at the end of the long table, nursing a glass of tap water while the waiter poured bottomless mimosas for everyone else. I had become the invisible woman. They looked through me. They talked over me. And when they did acknowledge me, it was with a pitying tilt of the head. as if I were a terminal patient they were about to euthanize for my own good. Logan was in rare form. He was wearing a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my entire monthly grocery budget. He tapped his fork against his champagne flute, not to make a toast, but just to enjoy the sound of his own importance. "The liquidity injection is timed perfectly," Logan announced, his voice carrying to the neighboring tables. "Once the bank clears the deadlock with Brianna, I am looking at an immediate influx of 7 figures into the fund. I have already told my partners to prepare the buy orders. We are going to corner the lithium market." He did not mention that he was currently being investigated by the SEC for his last attempt to corner a market, or that the 7 figures he was bragging about existed only in his imagination. Madeline sat across from him, scrolling through photos on her tablet. She looked up, her eyes bright with manic energy. "I know exactly what you mean. Logan," she said, "I just came from the West Loop. I found it. The perfect space. Exposed brick, 20-foot ceilings, natural light. The landlord wants a 3-year lease signed by Friday. But with the trust unlocking, I told him money is no object." She turned the tablet around to show Aunt Sarah a picture of an empty warehouse. "I am going to call it The Sanctuary," Madeline gushed. "It will be a holistic content creation hub. I am hiring 3 full-time videographers and a personal branding consultant next week." Aunt Sarah nodded, tearing into a croissant. "It sounds wonderful. Darling, it is about time we put that money to work. It has been sitting stagnant for too long." Stagnant. That was their word for safe. That was their word for a portfolio that had weathered 2 recessions, because my grandmother refused to gamble on trends. I sat there, cutting a small piece of melon, listening to them spend millions of dollars they did not have. Madeline was signing a lease. Logan was preparing buy orders. Uncle Martin was talking about upgrading his membership at the country club to the platinum tier. They were essentially writing bad checks with their mouths, confident that I would be forced to cash them. The waiter arrived with the check. Usually, Harold picked up the tab for these Sunday rituals, a power move to assert his dominance as the patriarch. But today, he was feeling vindicated. He looked down the table at me. "Brianna," Harold said, his voice loud enough for the waiter to hear, "since you are going to have so much free time soon, perhaps you should start practicing independence. We would not want you to feel indebted to the family you have disappointed." He gestured for the waiter to split the check. The waiter looked confused. He looked at the bottles of champagne, the towers of seafood, and the untouched pastries scattered across the table. Then he looked at my plate, which held a single side of fruit. "Separate checks, sir?" the waiter asked. "Yes," Harold said, smiling tightly. "Separate checks." I did not flinch. I did not give him the satisfaction of seeing me embarrassed. I pulled out my debit card. It was worn and chipped at the edges. "Put the fruit and the coffee on this," I told the waiter softly. I watched the waiter walk away. I calculated the cost in my head. $18 plus tax and tip. That was $25. That was a week of bus fare. But I paid it. I signed the receipt with a steady hand. I was buying something more valuable than breakfast. I was buying the absolute moral high ground. I left the restaurant while they were still ordering dessert. I walked 4 blocks to the nearest bus stop, shedding the skin of the poor relation and putting on the armor of the social worker. By the time I arrived at the Harbor Street Support Center, the air had changed. The smell of expensive perfume and roasted coffee was replaced by the scent of industrial cleaner, damp wool, and urgency. The lobby was full. It was always full on Sundays. I went straight to my desk in the back. There was no time for mimosas here. I had a stack of case files waiting. For the next 6 hours, I did not stop. I negotiated a payment plan for a young man who was about to lose his truck, which was also his home. I spent 40 minutes on hold with a utility company, arguing that they could not shut off the heat for a 70-year-old woman just because she missed one payment. I helped a veteran navigate the labyrinth of the VA website to claim the disability benefits he had earned 2 decades ago. My family called this work a waste. They called it low value. Around 4 p.m, a man named David approached my desk. David had been one of my toughest cases. He had been on the streets for 3 years, battling addiction and the profound loneliness that comes with being invisible to society. We had worked together for 18 months. Today, he was wearing a clean shirt. He had shaved. "Miss Brianna," David said. He held his hands behind his back. "Hi." "David," I said, looking up from my paperwork. "You look sharp. How is the job at the warehouse going?" "It is good," he said. "It is hard work, but it is good. I got my first full paycheck on Friday." "That is fantastic," I said, and I meant it. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, looking nervous. "I wanted to bring you something. I know it is not much, but I have my own place now. I have a window, and I saw this." He brought his hands out. He was holding a small terracotta pot. Inside was a tiny, resilient, succulent plant. It was green and thick-leaved. A survivor. "And I wrote this," he said, placing a folded piece of lined notebook paper on the desk next to the plant. I unfolded the note. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. "To Brianna. They walked past me. You stopped. Thank you for giving me my name back." I looked at the note, then at the plant, and then at David. My throat felt tight. "Thank you. David," I said, "I will keep it on my desk. It is beautiful." I watched him walk away, his head held high. In that moment, the contrast between my two worlds snapped into sharp focus. At brunch, my family had spent thousands of dollars to feel important, yet they were hollow. They were chasing a feeling that they could never quite catch because they were trying to buy it. Here, with a $2 plant and a piece of scrap paper, I felt a sense of worth that was solid as rock. I was not the failure. I was the only one building something real. They were building facades. I was building foundations. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an email notification from Elena at Northbridge. I opened it. The subject line read, "Confirmation of Tuesday review session." I tapped out a reply immediately. "Elena, please revise the calendar invitations sent to all beneficiaries. I want the language to be precise." Elena replied within a minute. "What specific phrasing do you need?" I typed, "Change the meeting title to Mandatory Compliance Review with the Fund Manager," and in the body of the email, please include the line, "Attendance is required for the finalization of all access protocols." It was a subtle trap. To my family. Fund Manager sounded like a generic title. They would assume it meant some senior banker. Perhaps a vice president at Northbridge whom they could charm or bully. They would not suspect that the title referred to the woman they had stuck with the fruit bill at brunch. I hit send. 10 minutes later, my phone lit up with a text from Madeline in the family group chat. "Ugh, just got the invite from the bank. Mandatory meeting on Tuesday at 10. So annoying. Do we really have to go sit with some boring suit just to get our money?" Harold replied, "It is just a formality. We go in, we sign the new access forms, we get Brianna out of the way, and we leave, treat it as a victory lap." Logan added, "I will bring the champagne." I read the messages and felt a cold, calm smile spread across my face. I looked at the little succulent plant on my desk. It was tough. It could survive a drought. It didn't need to shout to be alive. I put the phone down. "Bring the champagne." "Logan," I whispered to the empty office, "bring the champagne. You are going to need a drink when you realize who is sitting at the head of the table." Tuesday morning arrived with a sky the color of bruised slate. The Northbridge Private Trust Services building was not a glass tower like my father's corporate headquarters. It was a limestone fortress built in the 1920s, a place designed to look like a vault that people lived in. It did not have panoramic views or espresso bars in the lobby. It had marble floors, heavy oak doors, and a silence so profound it felt like a library where the books were made of gold bars. I checked my reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors. I was wearing the same gray suit I had worn to the family ambush a few days ago, but I had had it dry cleaned and pressed until the creases were sharp enough to cut paper. I wore a white silk blouse underneath, buttoned to the collar. I had pulled my hair back into a severe, tight bun. I did not look like the tired social worker who spent her days arguing with utility companies. I looked like a foreclosure agent. When the elevator doors opened on the 6th floor, the silence of the bank was shattered. I could hear them before I saw them. The Pugh family had arrived, and they had brought their circus with them. The reception area of Northbridge was tasteful and understated, usually populated by elderly couples whispering about municipal bonds. Today, it looked like the VIP section of a nightclub at 2 a.m. My cousin Logan was leaning against the receptionist's mahogany desk, holding a bottle of Dom Perignon by the neck as if it were a beer. He was laughing loudly at something Uncle Martin had said, his head thrown back, mouth open. Madeline was standing by the window, holding her phone up at arm's length. She had a ring light clipped to the top of it. "Hey guys," she was saying to her screen, flashing a practiced, dazzling smile. "Just wanted to update you. I am at the bank right now, about to sign the papers for the biggest expansion in omni-media history. We are talking 7 figures. Guys, 7 figures. Swipe up to get on the wait list for the launch party." She spun around, catching the room in her frame. "Say hi to the money, everyone," she chirped. Aunt Sarah waved her diamond-encrusted hand. Even Harold, usually so concerned with decorum, gave a smug salute to the camera. They were high on anticipation. They were drunk on the idea that the obstacle, me, was about to be removed. I stood in the hallway for a moment, just watching them. They looked like children raiding a candy store, completely unaware that the store owner was standing behind them with the security tapes. Elena Ward stepped out of a side office. She looked pale. She was clutching a tablet to her chest, her knuckles white. She saw me and exhaled a breath she must have been holding for 20 minutes. "Brianna," she whispered, hurrying over to me. Her heels clicked softly on the marble. "It is a zoo out there." Logan tried to open that champagne bottle on the receptionist's desk. I had to threaten to call security. "Let them have their fun." "Elena," I said, my voice calm. "It is the last party they are going to enjoy for a very long time." Elena looked at me searchingly. She adjusted her glasses. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. "Once we go into that room, there is no going back. We are not just closing a loop. We are dropping a guillotine." I looked at my father, who was now showing the receptionist his watch, probably explaining how much it cost. I thought about the text messages. I thought about the negative value chart. I thought of the way they had laughed when I asked for the vote to be recorded. "This is not revenge, Elena," I said. I looked her in the eyes to make sure she understood. If I did this out of anger, I would be just like them. This is not about hurting them. This is about protecting what my grandmother built. This is responsibility. Elena nodded slowly. She straightened her spine, transitioning from the worried advisor back into the high-powered banker. "The conference room is prepped," she said. "Shall we?" We walked into the reception area together. The conversation died down, but only slightly. They looked at me with a mixture of amusement and annoyance. To them, I was just a procedural hurdle, a piece of paperwork that needed to be filed before the check cleared. "Ah, the guest of honor," Logan drawled, swinging the champagne bottle. Or should I say, the guest of exit. "You ready to sign the release forms? Bree, I promise I will pour you a glass before we kick you out." I did not answer him. I did not even look at him. I walked past him, the air displacement of my stride causing him to blink. I pushed open the heavy double doors to the main conference room. It was a stark contrast to the boardroom at Pugh Meridian. There was no glass. The walls were paneled in dark walnut. The table was a solid slab of oak that looked heavy enough to crush a car. There were no views of the city to distract us. There was only the table, the chairs, and the weight of serious money. I walked toward the head of the table. The room filled up behind me. Chairs scraped against the floor. Briefcases were thrown onto the table with careless thuds. The energy was chaotic, aggressive. Harold marched to the head of the table, the seat traditionally reserved for the chairman. He stopped when he saw me standing near it. I was not sitting in it, but I was standing at the immediate right, the position of the second-in-command, or the council. "Excuse me," Harold said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. He pointed a manicured finger toward the far end of the table, near the door. The peanut gallery is down there. Brianna, this end is for leadership. You know, people who actually contribute to the GDP. A few cousins snickered. Madeline was still recording, hiding her phone under the table to capture the audio. I did not move. I pulled out the chair to his right and sat down. I am comfortable here, Father, I said. Harold rolled his eyes and sat down at the head. He spread his arms wide, claiming the space. Fine, suit yourself. Just do not expect to stay long. Elena walked to the front of the room. She remained standing. She did not smile. She did not offer coffee. She placed her tablet on the table and clasped her hands. Good morning, everyone, Elena said. Her voice was steel. This meeting has been convened pursuant to the mandatory compliance protocols of the Pugh Family Trust. She looked around the room, making eye contact with every single person. We are here to address two specific agenda items. First, the formal petition submitted by Mr. Harold Pugh and co-signatories regarding the removal of Brianna Pugh as a beneficiary. Second, and concurrently, a comprehensive operational assessment of the Trust's current standing and future management. Martin, sitting halfway down the table, tapped his gold pen against the wood. Can we skip the preamble? Martin asked. We all know why we are here. We voted. The girl is out. We want to liquidate the bond holdings and fund the projects. Just show us where to sign so we can go to lunch. Yeah, Logan added. I have a wire transfer pending that needs to go out by 2 o'clock. Let us get to the part where we get access. Elena did not flinch at the interruption. She waited for them to finish, her face impassive. The operational assessment is not optional. Mr. Pugh, Elena said, under the terms of the trust, any change in beneficiary status triggers a full audit of the fund manager's performance. Harold waved his hand dismissively. Well, we know her performance, Harold said, gesturing at me without looking. She works at a homeless shelter. Her performance is 0. That is the whole point. Actually, Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, giving the words a sudden, heavy gravity. The audit refers to the performance of the trustee, the individual legally empowered to manage the assets. Right, the bank, Harold said. You guys have done fine. We are not firing you. Elena, we just want to change the instructions. Elena looked at Harold. Then she looked at me. The bank acts as the custodian. Mr. Pugh, Elena corrected him. We do not make the investment decisions. We do not authorize the discretionary spending. Those powers are vested in the sole trustee. There was a confused silence. A few people frowned. They had spent 2 years assuming the bank was running the show on autopilot. Well, bring him in then, Martin snapped. Bring in the manager. Let us tell him what we want. Elena took a half step back. The manager will address you directly, she said. 20 heads turned toward the door. They expected a man in a pinstriped suit. They expected a gray-haired banker with a briefcase. They expected someone they could intimidate, or bribe, or charm. The door remained closed. The silence in the room stretched out. It became uncomfortable. A fly buzzed somewhere near the ceiling. I reached down into my tote bag. The sound of the zipper was loud in the quiet room. I pulled out a folder. It was not a sleek, modern plastic binder. It was old, cracked leather, smelling of tobacco and lavender. It was the portfolio my grandmother, Margaret Pugh, had carried every day for 40 years. Every person at that table recognized it. It was the object she had used to bang on the table when she was angry. It was the object that had held the deeds to the very first properties the family had bought. I placed the leather folder on the heavy oak table. Thump. The sound was not loud, but it was final. It sounded like a judge's gavel. I rested my hand on the cover of the folder. I felt the worn texture of the leather under my fingertips. I looked up. I did not look at my father. I did not look at Elena. I looked at the empty space in the center of the room, and then I slowly panned my gaze to encompass every single one of them. Harold was staring at the folder. His face had gone slack. The arrogant smile was sliding off his face like oil on water. He recognized the folder, and he was beginning, just beginning, to understand why I was the one holding it. The champagne bottle in Logan's hand suddenly looked very heavy. Madeline's phone had stopped moving. I opened the folder. Harold checked his watch again, tapping the crystal face with an impatient fingernail. He looked at the closed mahogany door, then back at Elena. The silence in the room was thick, but it was the silence of irritation, not respect. "Elena, this is becoming ridiculous," Harold snapped. "We have been sitting here for 5 minutes. Where is the manager? Is he stuck in traffic? Is he reviewing the files? Go get him." Elena did not move toward the door. She adjusted her glasses, took a slow breath, and turned her body slightly so that she was facing the entire length of the table. "The manager is not stuck in traffic. Mr. Pugh?" Elena said, her voice clear and devoid of any tremor. "The manager has been present since the meeting began." Harold frowned, looking around the room as if he expected someone to pop out from behind the heavy velvet curtains. "What are you talking about? There is no one here but us and the—" He stopped. His eyes landed on me. He looked at the gray suit. He looked at the leather folder under my hand. He looked at the way I was sitting, not slumped in defeat, but upright, with my spine pressed against the back of the chair. Elena raised a hand and gestured toward me, palm open. "Ms. Brianna Pugh is the sole trustee of the Pugh Family Trust," Elena announced. "She is the manager. She is the chairwoman. She is the only person in this room with signature authority." For 3 seconds, the room was a vacuum. No one breathed. No one moved. The concept was so foreign, so completely at odds with the reality they had constructed for themselves, that their brains simply refused to process it. Then, gravity reasserted itself. Logan, whose mouth had fallen open in a stupor, lost his grip on the bottle of Dom Perignon. It slipped through his sweat-slicked fingers and hit the edge of the heavy oak table with a sickening clunk before rolling onto the carpet. The sound was like a gunshot in a library. A thin stream of foaming champagne fizzed out onto the floor, soaking into the expensive weave. But Logan did not look down. He was staring at me as if I had just grown a second head. Harold blinked, then he blinked again, and then he laughed. It was a loud, booming laugh that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. Okay, Harold chuckled, wiping a tear from his eye. "Very funny. Elena, very dramatic. Did Brianna put you up to this? Is this her little way of feeling important before she signs the exit papers? It is cute, really. Now, bring in the real damn lawyer so we can finish this." Elena did not smile. She tapped the screen of her tablet. The large monitor mounted on the wall behind me flickered to life. A legal document appeared, magnified, for everyone to see. It was the trust transfer agreement, dated 2 years ago. Highlighted in yellow was the clause I had memorized in the dark. Automatic transfer of authority. "I suggest you read the screen, Harold," Elena said, her voice dropping the customer service warmth she usually employed. 2 years after the passing of Margaret Pugh, the provisional bank oversight ended. As of August 14th of this year, full discretionary control transferred to the designated steward. She tapped the screen again. The camera zoomed in on the signature line. Steward, Brianna Marie Pugh. Harold's laugh died in his throat. He squinted at the screen. He looked at the date. He looked at the signature. His face went from flush to an ashy gray in the span of a heartbeat. That is not possible," he stammered. "We had an agreement, the soft agreement. You were just supposed to be a figurehead. You were supposed to sign what we told you to sign." I finally spoke. My voice was low, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried like a bell. "I did sign what you told me to sign. Father," I said, "for 2 years, I let you play. I let you believe that the money was an endless river. But I was never a figurehead. I was a student, and you were the lesson." I opened the leather folder. Inside was not a chaotic mess of papers, but a neatly organized stack of spreadsheets, printed on heavy bond paper. "You asked for an audit," I said, sliding the first sheet toward the center of the table. So let us audit. I stood up, I walked to the screen, standing next to the projection of my name. For the last 8 years, I continued, my voice gaining strength. I have tracked every single withdrawal, every investment, and every loss this family has generated. While you were mocking my $35,000 salary, I was monitoring the $50 million you were systematically setting on fire. I pressed a button on a remote control I had taken from my pocket. The screen changed. A bar graph appeared. It showed a massive red line plunging downward. Let us start with the Aspen Wellness Retreat, I said, looking at Uncle Martin. Martin shrank back in his chair, suddenly finding the grain of the wood table fascinating. You requested $600,000 for zoning and architecture. I said, my audit shows that $400,000 of that went to private jet charters and luxury accommodation for your friends. There are no blueprints. There is no land deed. There is just a hole in the balance sheet where the money used to be. I clicked the remote. A new slide appeared. It showed a montage of Madeline's Instagram posts, overlaid with financial figures. The Omni Media Collective. I said, Madeline, you claimed this studio was a vital brand asset. You have drawn down $7,000 a month for rent. You have expensed $40,000 in wardrobe and travel. I looked at her. She was clutching her phone, but she wasn't recording anymore. Her face was pale. The return on investment is negative 98%. I said, you are not running a business. You are running a vanity project funded by the interest on money you did not earn. I turned to Logan. He was trying to clean up the champagne with his shoe, looking like a guilty schoolboy. And the Pew Venture Capital arm. I said, $5 million requested, $2 million already burned. Logan, your trading algorithm has not beaten the market. It has not even beaten a savings account. You are paying previous investors with new capital. In the world of finance, which you claim to master, that is called a Ponzi scheme. I let the word hang there. Ponzi scheme. Harold slammed his hand on the table. Enough, he shouted. He stood up, his face purple. This is absurd. You are twisting the numbers. We are building long-term value. You do not understand how business works because you have never run one. You hand out soup. You are a social worker. He pointed a shaking finger at me. We are the pews. We generate the wealth. And you are just the mistake we are trying to correct. I looked at him calmly. I reached into the folder and pulled out the document they had sent to the bank just 48 hours ago. The petition to remove me. I am glad you brought that up. Father, I said. I held the document up. I read your petition very carefully. I read the part where you called me financially illiterate. I read the part where you described my life's work as low-value activity. And I read the part where you stated, quite clearly, that anyone who does not contribute to the legacy should be removed from the trust. I walked back to the table and tossed the document down in front of him. You called me a failure in writing. I said, you put it in the permanent record. I looked around the room. At the Harbor Street Support Center, I manage a budget of $200,000 a year. With that money, we feed 3,000 people. We house 50 veterans. We put 20 people through job training. My audit passed with 0 discrepancies for 5 years running. That is efficiency. That is value. I pointed at the screen, where the red lines of their spending were still glowing. You have access to $50 million, and with it, you have built nothing but debt and embarrassing headlines. You have not created value. You have consumed it. Harold looked at the document in front of him. He looked at Elena. Elena, he said, his voice straining to be reasonable. Pull the petition. We are withdrawing it. It was a draft. We did not mean to file it formally. Just delete it from the system. Elena shook her head slowly. I cannot do that. Mr. Pugh, she said, as you insisted on the phone, the document was filed as a Priority 1 legal motion. It has been logged in the bank's central compliance server. It is immutable. It is part of the permanent history of the trust. Harold slumped back into his chair. He looked like a man who had just watched his house collapse. I walked back to my seat, the seat at the right hand of the head of the table, and sat down. I folded my hands over the leather folder. You wanted to apply the merit clause. I said, you wanted to strip the assets from anyone who was failing to uphold the standards of the Pew legacy. I looked at my father, then at Martin, then at Logan and Madeline. You set the rules. You defined the terms of failure. You called me a failure by your standards. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than any shout. Now, I must examine the consequences of that choice, but I will not be using your standards. I will be using mine. The silence that followed the initial outburst was not the silence of peace. It was the vacuum before an implosion. Brianna stood at the head of the mahogany table, her hand resting lightly on the remote control for the projector. She did not look like a woman who had just been screamed at by her entire family. She looked like a surgeon preparing to announce that the patient was terminal, and that the patient was their lifestyle. She pressed the button, the screen behind her, which had previously displayed the innocuous family crest, shifted to a jagged, descending red line set against a stark white background. It looked like a cliff face. My duty, Brianna began, her voice devoid of the earlier tremor, stripped of any familial warmth, is not to your vacations, it is not to your social standing in the Hamptons, or your reputation at the country club. My duty, legally and morally, is to the preservation of the Blackwell legacy for the generations that do not yet exist. You look at this fund as a harvest. I look at it as seed corn. She walked toward the screen, her shadow cutting across the projection. Look at the trajectory, she commanded. This model assumes we continue with the disbursement rates you have demanded over the last 5 years. It accounts for inflation, market volatility, and your increasing appetites. Do you see where the line hits zero? That is not 50 years from now. That is not even 30 years from now. If we do not stop bleeding capital, this family will be effectively insolvent in 15 to 20 years. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room, but Brianna cut it off with a sharp gesture. Insolvent, she repeated, tasting the word. That means the houses go, the retainers go, the tuition payments stop. You become what you fear most, ordinary. She clicked the remote again. The screen changed to a scanned image of an old, yellowed document. The handwriting was elegant but forceful. The hand of their grandmother, the matriarch who had built the empire they were so busy dismantling. Grandmother wrote this manifesto 40 years ago, Brianna said, reading the text aloud, though everyone in the room knew it. The purpose of this wealth is to empower, not to cripple. It is to help the community and foster innovation. Do not let the legacy be eroded by arrogance or sloth. We have violated every single syllable of this mandate. Harold shifted in his seat, his face flushing a deep crimson. You are twisting her words. Brianna, she wanted us to live well. She didn't want us living like monks while you hoard gold like a dragon. Brianna turned her gaze on her uncle. It was a look of profound, chilling disappointment. You think I have been hoarding? She asked softly. You think I have been sitting on this money for the sheer joy of possession? Let me tell you what I have actually been doing for the last 2 years. She placed her hands flat on the table, leaning forward. I saw this crash coming, not the market crash, but the family crash. 2 years ago, I realized that your spending was outpacing our yields by nearly 40%. To prevent the fund from collapsing then and there, I started shadowboxing with the portfolio. I moved assets into lower liquidity, long-term trusts. I created bureaucratic hurdles. I purposely slowed down the approval processes for high-risk withdrawals. Harold's eyes widened, his mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. The bank errors, he whispered. Last summer, in Zurich, my cards were declined for 3 days. The bank said it was a system migration. It was not a system migration. Harold, Brianna said, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. I flagged the transaction. You were trying to buy a vintage race car using funds allocated for charitable matching. I froze the account until the liquidity could be sourced from a non-essential vertical. I saved you from committing tax fraud, and I saved the fund $500,000 in penalties. And the renovation loan? Cousin Julianne shouted. standing up. The 6 months of delays? The missing paperwork? There was no missing paperwork, Brianna replied calmly. I delayed the release because you were about to sign a contract with a developer who was under federal investigation for racketeering. I stalled until he was indicted. I saved you $3 million. The room erupted. It was no longer just anger. It was the fury of the exposed. They felt manipulated, parented, and controlled. You had no right, Julianne screamed. You are a trustee, not a god. You betrayed this family. You lied to us. I protected you from yourselves. Brianna's voice rose, matching their volume for the first time, cracking the veneer of ice just enough to show the steel underneath. I have spent 2 years patching the holes you keep punching in the hull of this ship. I have been the only thing standing between you and bankruptcy. She pulled a thick binder from her briefcase and slammed it onto the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. You want to talk about betrayal? Let's talk about the requests. She flipped the binder open. January 4th. Cousin Mark requests $200,000 for a tech startup. No business plan, no revenue model. Just a napkin with an app idea that already exists. Denied. She flipped the page. March 12th. Aunt Sarah. Request for $1.5 million for a wellness retreat property in Sedona. No appraisal, no market analysis. The property was listed at $800,000. You wanted the extra $700,000 for operating costs, which I later found out was code for a personal salary. Denied. She looked up, her eyes scanning the faces of her accusers. Every time you asked for money without a plan, without a budget, without a shred of respect for where that money came from, you were betraying grandmother. I was the only one keeping faith. Harold stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. This ends now. We will petition the board. We will have you removed for breach of fiduciary duty. You are acting in bad faith. Brianna, you are hiding assets and manipulating beneficiaries. Go ahead, Brianna said, her voice dropping back to that terrifyingly calm register. Sue me. But before you call your lawyers, you might want to read the document I just emailed to all of you. She gestured to Elena, who had been sitting silently in the corner, observing the proceedings with the detached interest of a seasoned litigator. Elena, Brianna said, please explain the responsibility activation clause. Elena stood up, smoothing her skirt. She adjusted her glasses and looked at the family. The responsibility activation clause, Elena began, her tone professional and dry, is a little-known provision in the original trust charter. It was inserted by your grandmother to prevent exactly this scenario. It states that if the beneficiaries attempt to obstruct the trustee in the execution of their duty to preserve the principal capital, or if they demonstrate a pattern of financial negligence that threatens the fund's solvency, the trustee is granted emergency powers. Elena paused, letting the words sink in. Those powers include the right to unilaterally freeze all discretionary disbursements. It allows the trustee to suspend all non-essential payments until a third-party audit is completed, and it shifts the burden of proof in a standard removal hearing. Brianna would have to prove she's doing a good job. Under this clause, because you have threatened the stability of the fund, you would have to prove, with hard evidence, that she has committed a crime. Not that she was strict, not that she was secretive, but that she stole. We will find the evidence, Julianne shouted, though she looked less certain now. She admitted to manipulating the accounts. She admitted to restructuring assets to protect the principal, Elena corrected. That is the definition of a trustee's job. I have reviewed her moves. Every transfer, every freeze, every delay was legally sound and financially prudent. If you take this to court, you will lose. And while the lawsuit drags on for 3 or 4 years, the responsibility activation clause means Brianna can legally cut you off completely. No monthly stipends, no tuition, no mortgage payments, nothing. The silence that fell over the room this time was absolute. It was the silence of a trap snapping shut. Harold sank back into his chair. He looked at the chart on the screen, then at the binder on the table, and finally at his niece. He looked old. Suddenly, the bluster drained out of him, leaving only the realization of his own impotence. Brianna closed the binder. She did not smile. There was no triumph in her face, only a weary resolution. She looked at her family, her aunts, uncles, cousins, people she had once looked up to, people she had wanted to please. She realized she had outgrown them long ago. "I did not want to do this," Brianna said quietly. "I wanted us to work together. I wanted you to understand the gravity of our situation. But you forced my hand. You backed me into a corner where I had to choose between being your friend and being your guardian." She gathered her papers, her movements precise and final. "You threatened to sue me. You threatened to destroy my reputation. You accused me of theft when I was the only one saving you from ruin." She looked directly at Harold. "You are the ones who made this adversarial. You are the ones who decided that oversight was oppression." She walked toward the door, stopping just before she exited. She turned back one last time. The projection of the declining red line still glowed behind her, a warning beacon in the dim room. "The accounts are frozen as of this morning," Brianna declared, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Until you can present me with a viable, audited plan for sustainable spending, until you can prove you understand what this legacy actually means, the bank is closed. You triggered this clause, not me." She opened the door and walked out, leaving them alone with the charts, the silence, and the cold, hard truth of their own making. The hallway outside the boardroom felt less like a corridor in a luxury estate and more like the holding cell of a courthouse. The air conditioning hummed with an aggressive chill, or perhaps it was just the collective drop in body temperature of the Blackwell family. The united front, that wall of polished hostility they had presented to Brianna only an hour ago, had crumbled into terrified fragments. They had splintered into small, frantic clusters, near the water cooler. Cousin Julianne was frantically texting, her thumbs blurring over the screen, likely trying to cancel pending wire transfers before they bounced. Aunt Sarah was weeping quietly into a silk handkerchief, while Uncle Robert paced back and forth, muttering about liquidity ratios and legal precedents. The reality of the frozen accounts had hit them with the physical force of a slap. Brianna stood near the window, watching the rain streak the glass. She felt hollowed out. Victory did not taste sweet. It tasted like ash and stale coffee. "Brianna." She turned. Uncle Harold was standing there. He did not look like the imperious patriarch who had demanded her resignation that morning. His shoulders were slumped, and the lines around his mouth seemed to have deepened by a decade in the span of 30 minutes. He gestured toward the small, private study adjacent to the boardroom. "A word," he said, his voice raspy. "Please." Brianna followed him inside. The study was lined with books that Harold had likely never read, leather-bound volumes on history and philosophy that served only as insulation for the room. Harold closed the door and leaned against it, as if to physically bar the rest of the world from entering. "You have destroyed us," Harold said. It wasn't an accusation so much as a statement of fact. "You have cut the legs off your own family." "I stopped the bleeding, Uncle," Brianna replied, her voice steady but quiet. "There is a difference." "You call this stopping the bleeding?" Harold pushed off the door and walked toward her, his hands shaking slightly. "You humiliated us in there. You treated us like delinquent children. We are your blood. Brianna, we raised you." "You tolerated me," Brianna corrected him. She looked him in the eye, refusing to blink. "Let us be honest, Uncle. You tolerated me because grandmother left me the chair. If she hadn't, I would just be the weird niece who cares too much about soup kitchens." Harold flinched. "That is not fair." "Is it?" Brianna stepped closer, invading his personal space for the first time in her life. "Do you remember the gala 3 years ago? The one for the pediatric oncology wing? I spent 6 months organizing that. I raised $2 million. And do you remember what you said to me when I came to your table, so proud of what we had achieved?" Harold looked away, his jaw working. "You laughed," Brianna said, the memory sharp as a shard of glass. "You turned to your business partners and said, 'Look at her, our little Mother Teresa. If only she put this much effort into real work. She might actually be worth something. You mocked my compassion. Harold, you have always viewed my desire to help others as a defect, a weakness in the Blackwell genetic code. I wanted you to be tough, Harold exploded, his voice cracking. I wanted you to succeed. In this world, Brianna, success is not measured in thank you notes from orphans. It is measured in leverage. It is measured in net worth. I pushed you because I wanted you to be strong enough to hold on to what we have. I wanted you to make the family proud by making the family rich. I am rich, Brianna said softly. And we were already rich. You just wanted more. You wanted the kind of wealth that makes you feel like a king, because deep down, you are terrified of being ordinary. She walked over to the desk and ran her hand along the edge. I almost left. 5 years ago, before grandmother died, I had a job offer at a nonprofit in Chicago. I was going to walk away from the trust, the estate, all of it. I didn't want this burden. Harold stared at her, stunned. Why didn't you? Because grandmother asked me to stay, Brianna said. She knew exactly who you were. She knew who Julianne was. She told me that if I left, the vultures would pick the bones clean within a decade. She trusted me to be the wall, so I stayed. I sacrificed my own peace to protect your lifestyle. And you call that betrayal? Harold opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The narrative he had built, that Brianna was the villain and he was the victim, was dissolving under the weight of the truth. He looked small. He looked defeated. He started, then stopped. He rubbed his face with his hands. I just didn't want to lose the house in the vineyard. It defines me. Brianna. Then you should have built a life that was defined by something other than real estate, she said, her tone devoid of pity. There was a knock at the door. It opened a crack, and Mia, her 22-year-old cousin, slipped in. Mia looked like a deer caught in headlights. Her mascara was smudged. Brianna? Mia whispered. Can I come in? Brianna nodded. Harold turned away, staring at the books, unable to face his niece. Mia twisted her hands together. I wanted to say I'm sorry. Sorry for what, Mia? For raising my hand, Mia said, her voice trembling. When they asked for the vote to remove you, I didn't want to. I know you helped me with my student loans last year. I know you're the reason I could go to art school. Then why did you vote against me? Brianna asked gently. Because Julianne told me that if I didn't, the family would cut me off, Mia confessed, tears spilling over. She said that if we didn't stick together, you would take everything away. I was scared. Brianna, I don't know anything about finance. I just didn't want to be an outcast. Brianna sighed. A long, weary sound. This was the insidious nature of the toxicity her uncle had cultivated. It ruled by fear. You are not an outcast, Mia, Brianna said. But you need to understand that blind loyalty to people who are driving the bus off a cliff is not love. It is suicide. As Mia sniffled and nodded, the door opened wider. Aunt Evelyn stood there. She was the oldest of the siblings, a woman who usually spent family gatherings in a haze of gin and tonic, saying very little, but today, her eyes were clear. She walked past Harold, ignoring him completely, and stopped in front of Brianna. She reached out and touched Brianna's cheek with a cold hand. Your grandmother, Evelyn whispered, her voice like dry leaves. She told me something. The week before she passed, we were sitting in the garden. She said, Evelyn, there will come a day when the money runs low and the tempers run high. And on that day, if Brianna looks at you with the eyes of the legacy keeper, not the niece, not the girl, but the keeper, you listen to her. Because on that day, she is the only one who sees the future. Evelyn dropped her hand. I saw that look in the boardroom. Brianna, I should have spoken up sooner. I was a coward. Harold turned from the bookshelf. The room was heavy with the ghosts of the past and the failures of the present. We need to go back in, Brianna said, buttoning her blazer. It felt like armor. Elena is waiting. When they re-entered the boardroom, The atmosphere had shifted again. The aggression was gone, replaced by a desperate, fawning hope. People sat up straighter. Smiles were forced and brittle. It was pathetic. Elena stood at the head of the table. "Please take your seats. The trustee is ready to announce the path forward." Brianna walked to the head of the table. She did not sit. She stood tall, placing her hands on the leather binder that contained the records of their excess. "We didn't mean it, Brianna," Cousin Mark blurted out, unable to stand the silence. "We were just stressed. The market has been crazy. We respect you." "We love you, honey," Aunt Sarah added, her voice wobbling. "We know you're doing your best." "Save it," Brianna said. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice cut through their platitudes like a knife through rotten fruit. "I am done with the lies. I am done with the flattery when you need a check and the insults when you don't." She opened the binder. "For years, you have lectured me about standards. You have told me that the Blackwell name means excellence. You have told me that we cannot support losers or people who don't contribute to society. You wanted to rewrite the trust to exclude anyone who didn't meet your definition of success." She looked around the table, meeting every pair of eyes. "You wanted a meritocracy? You wanted to strip the inheritance from the failures? Fine." She pulled a single sheet of paper from the binder and held it up. "I am accepting your proposal, not the one to remove me, the one to implement performance standards, but I am applying those standards to you." A confused murmur ran through the room. "What does that mean?" Harold asked, sinking into his chair. "It means," Brianna said, her voice ringing with finality, "that as of today, the unconditional monthly stipend is abolished. The allowance for simply existing with the last name Blackwell is 0. "You can't do that," Julianne shrieked. "How will we live?" "You will live by the standards you claim to cherish," Brianna replied. "I am restructuring the trust into an incentive-based grant system. If you want money for a business, you will submit a business plan that will be vetted by an external firm. If the business makes a profit, the trust will match it. If you want money for education, you will maintain a 3.5 grade point average. If you want money for living expenses, you will provide proof of full-time employment or active, verified service in the charitable sector for at least 30 hours a week." She slammed the binder shut. "You wanted to cut off the dead weight? I agree. I am looking at a room full of people who have not generated a single dollar of value in 20 years. From this moment on, you eat what you kill. You want to be successful? Go out there and prove it. The free ride is over." The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It wasn't the silence of shock or fear. It was the silence of a reality that could not be negotiated with. It was the sound of the umbilical cord being cut. "I will review the first round of grant applications in 90 days, Brianna said, turning to leave. "I suggest you spend that time updating your resumes. Meeting adjourned." The energy in the room had shifted from chaotic panic to a stunned, heavy silence. It was the atmosphere of a courtroom after the gavel has banged down on a guilty verdict. Brianna stood at the head of the table, her figure framed by the rain-lashed window behind her. She did not look like a woman who had just survived an attempted coup. She looked like a CEO concluding a hostile takeover. Only the company she had acquired was her own family. "Regarding the motion to remove me as trustee," Brianna began, her voice level and devoid of triumph, "let the record show that the motion is formally rejected, not only because you lack the legal standing to enforce it, but because the responsibility activation clause explicitly forbids a change in leadership during a period of manufactured insolvency. You broke the ship. You do not get to fire the captain who is patching the hull." She motioned to Elena, who began distributing a new stack of documents. These were not thick binders, but single, crisp sheets of paper with the new terms of engagement. "This is the new reality," Brianna announced. "Effective immediately. The trust is entering a phase of radical restructuring. The era of the blank check is dead. It will not be revived." Uncle Harold stared at the paper in front of him, his face gray. "Restructuring," he muttered, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "Precisely," Brianna said. Every beneficiary over the age of 18 is now required to submit an annual responsibility report. This is not a suggestion. It is a mandatory audit. You will document exactly how the funds you receive are used. If you claim money for housing, I want to see the lease. If you claim money for healthcare, I want to see the invoices. If you claim money for business development, I want to see the profit and loss statements. She walked slowly down the length of the table, her heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. If the report is late, your access is frozen. If the report is incomplete, your access is frozen. And if I find a single instance of funds being diverted for unauthorized luxury expenses, like a vintage race car disguised as charitable matching, your access will be permanently revoked. A ripple of fear went through the cousins. They were used to vague promises and easy money. They were not used to accountability. Now, regarding the vote that just took place, Brianna continued, stopping behind the chair where her cousin Julianne sat. Julianne flinched. There are consequences for actions. You attempted to dismantle the governance of this family to serve your own greed. That demonstrates a profound lack of judgment. Therefore, I am designating everyone who raised their hand in favor of my removal as high-risk beneficiaries. What does that mean? Julianne whispered, her voice trembling. It means your discretionary access is reduced by 75%, Brianna stated coldly. You will remain on this probationary status until you complete a certified financial literacy course and demonstrate 2 consecutive years of fiscal solvency independent of the trust. You need to learn how to manage money before you are trusted with ours. She turned her gaze to the end of the table. Uncle Harold, Cousin Martin. The 2 men looked up. Martin looked like he was about to be sick. You were the architects of this revolt, Brianna said. You incited the family. You spread lies about my management. You weaponized the anxieties of your relatives. Because of this act of malice, you are placed under a Tier 1 restriction. Harold stood up, his legs shaking. You cannot do this. Brianna, we are partners. We are not partners, she corrected him. I am the guardian. You are the threat. Under Tier 1, you are barred from receiving any capital investment for business projects for a period of 3 years. No startups, no real estate ventures, no sure things. You will live on a basic stipend, capped at the median income of a Chicago resident. Learn what it means to live within a budget. Martin slammed his fist on the table. 3 years? That will ruin me. I have investors lined up. Then you better hope they invest in you for your talent and not your last name, Brianna replied, unmoved. Because the Blackwell Bank is closed to you. The room was suffocating, but Brianna was not finished. Her expression softened slightly as she looked toward the younger cousins and the few elderly aunts who had remained silent during the shouting match. However, she said, her voice taking on a different texture, I am not a tyrant. My goal is not to punish the innocent. The Educational Scholarship Fund for the children remains untouched. In fact, I am increasing the allocation for tuition by 10%. I want the next generation to be educated, not entitled. Furthermore, the medical stipends for our elderly relatives will continue without interruption. I will not compromise the health of this family, only its ego. She walked back to the head of the table and picked up a separate folder. It was blue, distinct from the others. Finally, I am announcing the creation of the Margaret Pugh Stewardship Fund. This is a new entity, separate from the main trust. Its sole purpose is community development and direct aid to the underprivileged in Chicago. And where is the money coming from? Harold sneered, trying to find one last point of attack. Are you taking that from us too? No, Brianna said. I am taking it from myself. She held up the folder. I am voluntarily diverting 60% of my own trustee compensation and my personal inheritance share into this new fund. I am putting my own skin in the game. I will not ask you to sacrifice anything I am not willing to sacrifice myself. This money will go to the people grandmother actually wanted to help. It will rebuild the community center you mocked. It will feed the families you ignore. She let the folder drop onto the table. And one last thing. The minutes of this meeting. including the record of your failed vote to remove me and the detailed list of your frivolous spending requests, are being notarized today. They will be permanently attached to the Trust's founding documents. Future generations will be able to read exactly who stood for the legacy and who stood for their own pockets. It will serve as a value lesson for the Blackwell descendants. Logan, a younger cousin who had been banking on a large payout to fund a gap year in Europe, suddenly stood up. His face was red, his eyes wet with angry tears. "You have ruined our lives," he screamed, his voice cracking. "You have destroyed everything. We have nothing now. How can you sleep at night? You are a monster." Brianna looked at him. She did not see a monster. She saw a boy who had never been told no in his entire life. She felt a pang of pity, but she smothered it. Pity would not save him. Reality would. "Logan," she said, her voice cutting through his hysteria, "listen to me very carefully. If your life can be ruined simply because you lost access to money you did not earn, money you did not work for, and money you did not deserve, then your life had no value to begin with." Logan froze, the words hitting him like a physical blow. "You are 24 years old," Brianna said. "You have 2 hands and a brain. Go build a life that is actually yours. Don't blame me because I refuse to finance your delusions." She closed her briefcase. The snap of the latches signaled the end. "From now on," Brianna declared, looking around the room one last time, "the legacy belongs to those who respect it. The meeting is adjourned." She did not wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Elena was already there, holding the door open. Brianna stepped out into the hallway, leaving the stagnant air of the boardroom behind her. She walked through the opulent corridors of the estate, past the oil paintings of ancestors who stared down with judgment. She didn't care about their judgment anymore. She had honored the only one that mattered. She pushed open the main doors of the building and stepped out onto the street. The Chicago wind hit her instantly, sharp and biting. It was a cold, gray afternoon, the kind that seeped into your bones. But to Brianna, it felt incredible. It felt like oxygen. It felt like freedom. She buttoned her coat and checked her watch. It was 2:00. The soup kitchen at the community center would be starting the dinner prep soon. They were short-handed today. They needed someone to chop vegetables. They needed someone to organize the pantry. They needed help. Brianna began to walk, her pace quick and purposeful. She wasn't walking away from her family. She was walking toward her true purpose. The trust was safe. The legacy was secure. But her work, her real work, was just beginning. The wind whipped her hair, but she didn't shiver. She was warm, fueled by the fire of a promise kept and a future reclaimed. She disappeared into the bustling city streets, just another woman in a coat, heading to where she was needed most. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from. So please comment down below with your location, and let's get a conversation started about what you would have done in Brianna's shoes. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Lila Revenge Stories, like this video, and smash that hype button to help this story get recommended to more people.